Good early afternoon. We are live here on the Blue Plate Special. I'm Andy Andrews. You have joined us at Wisdom Harbor Studios in Orange Beach, Alabama. We're here at the Wharf, home of the famous Marlin statues and the infamous escalator statues. When you visit us here, you have to take a picture with both. And if you're joining us here for the first time, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're here. If you're on Facebook, please click that notification button and turn your notifications on your phone. That way, when we go live, anytime we go live, you will be notified. And if you could share this episode, we would appreciate that. We're going to have a good show. We're going to have a good show. So go ahead and share it. Now, the title of our show is that we'll get to in just a little bit is going to be The Civil War Odd Facts Known by Few. So that's going to be the title of the show. If you're joining us on YouTube, please click that subscribe button. Click it 3 or 4 times. That'll help us. And kind of like voting in Louisiana, you know. So if you're with LinkedIn, just loosen your tie. Business people, join us. It's just a little time of lunchtime learning and laughter. So if you're with LinkedIn, just continue to eat your bologna sandwich and listen up. Also, Twitter, the Twitterverse. It's good to see you guys, as long as we aren't banned today for something we've said or done or were or weren't. So, but Brian Backen is your captain, and we're glad to have you here. Patricia Clapp from North Carolina. Hey, you shared. Thank you so much. Marcy Crosser Taylor from Pasco, Washington. Bob Woodall. Bob Woodall, how's your elbow, dude? I hope you're okay. You know, I mean, when I saw you in that hospital wheelchair, you looked pretty rough. But, you know, you had a cast from here to here. And so I hope the elbow surgery went good. So I hope it doesn't ruin your violin playing. Not that you could ever play, but maybe something miraculous will happen. Irene Robinson, how are you? Irene Robinson from Oak Grove, Louisiana. And I already made a crack about Louisiana, and there's Irene. Well, we're glad to have you. Jeff Herring, hey, buddy, how are you? Margaret Davis, hot from sunny Mississippi. Judith DeWitt from Spokane Valley. Betty Garner from Florida. And we have number one, we have our regulars in the studio, our Tuesday couple, Lynn and Jim. We're glad to have y'all here, the Tuesday couple. I was looking, it's so bright out there that you guys appear as silhouettes to me. So, but I can kind of see. We're glad you're here. And you brought some friends, Nancy and Jim, from Spring Branch, Texas. Where's Spring Branch? I can't hear you. I'm assuming that Spring Branch is probably like everywhere else in Texas, which everywhere you go in Texas seems like you're 200 miles from Amarillo. I've seen that sign a million times, so probably 200 miles from Amarillo. Jacob Norse Luker. Jacob Norse. See, I love that name. That was my Uncle Norse. So Jacob is kind of my cousin, but because he wasn't really my uncle. But hey, how about that? David and Becky Orr are here. So Roger, Suzanne, if you're on, David and Becky Orr are here. Jacob Norsluger, that's Suzanne's son. And he's named after his granddad, middle name after granddad. But I think what a great name. It's a Viking name. You ever know anybody named Norse? I mean, I think that's a great name. But David and Becky Orr are here. And do you know let me just tell you this. I don't know if you know, but David, right over here, David is he is my earliest memory on this earth. I mean, I remember David before I remember anything about mom or daddy, because I was 2 years old, and I can just picture myself at the telephone and talking to the Easter Bunny, and it was David. So, but don't give him too much credit for making me happy, because about a year later on Halloween, David was in high school. How old were you? Like a junior or senior? And Mom and Daddy sent me to the door to answer it on Halloween, and David was standing there with two of his friends. They were in tuxedos, and their faces were green, and they had teeth, and it scared me to death. So thank you, David. Thank you so much. Yeah. My earliest memories being Easter bunnied and Halloweened by David Orr. So Janet Ravensdale, did you enjoy West this morning? Man, I appreciate you already watching the Professional Noticer podcast. Kevin Perkins, hey old man, I really appreciate you watching the podcast that quick. It just came out this morning. Wes Hampton was our guest. Wes is a Grammy Award winner, a Dove Award winner. He's currently in the Gaither Vocal Band. And man, that Professional Noticer episode was interesting, but it was surprisingly funny. I mean,
very funny.
It was very funny. I mean, I don't know if it'd be funny to Bill if he watched that. Wes tells a story that one of the first performances he was doing. Well, you have to watch the show, but he was doing a thing with Bill, and Bill sang the wrong words, which I think is hilarious. But he will tell the story on this Professional Noticer episode. He will tell the story of the most grueling audition process I have ever heard anybody having. Anybody. I mean, Wes auditioning for the vocal band, it was the most grueling experience I've ever heard of anybody auditioning. And if you're not getting the Professional Noticer, just go to andyandrews.com and sign up for the VIP mailing list, and it'll come right to your inbox. Johnny Hall, you finished Will the Circle Be Unbroken? That's a great book, isn't it? That is a great book. And Christine Morgan from Cornelius, one of the Carolinas. Cheers DeWitt. You like the picture of the sunshine behind me? Well, let me just tell you this. These two, can you see both of these? Can you see? Yeah, you can see this one and this one. I took both of those. That is the same boat, and that was 15 minutes before that. Both of them in the morning. So, same boat, same morning, 15 minutes difference in the picture. Oh, Matt says I might have to say that closer to the mic. Well, it's the same morning I took those pictures, and it's the same boat in the pictures, and it was 15 minutes apart that I took the pictures. Speaking of morning, Jennifer Budd, we're so glad to have you here. You're in Australia, and it's 3:15 a.m. in Australia. Oh my gosh. Christy says to tell the Orrs hello. So, you knew in Norval, well, that's not Norse, Norval, Victor Swindell, Oh, really? You love how the closed caption has issues with my accent? Really? I don't think I have an accent, but that's just me. Yeah, you gotta watch Wes. You gotta watch Wes and sign up for the podcast. Dean O'Brien, Charleston, South Carolina. Okay. Are you ready to get to the Civil War? Odd facts known by few. You know, the Civil War, I'm very familiar with it, and I always think everybody else is, but we were down asking some people in Southern Grind down below us, asking them just some trivia questions just for a video we're putting together, and I asked Little M, was that a kid or an adult? It was an adult, wasn't it? That we asked, like, when was the Civil War? Yeah, it was an adult, and she said, like during the Middle Ages, like the 1500s? No, that would be before the country was actually happening. But I think that people are generally familiar with it, but I kind of surreptitiously ask some people, the Civil War ran? And I'm shocked at how many people can't answer that. But just in case, certainly nobody watching this is one of those. But the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. So that's what happened. And believe it or not, since then, what are you doing? Just browsing? Oh, you're trying to respond to people? Well, put me back to the books. I want to tell them about the books. Yeah, this is a cool odd fact. I just want to make sure I had the number right. But since the last shot was fired in June of 1865, more than 60,000 books have been written about the Civil War. Can you imagine? So here's an odd fact. This is a very cool one, but I found this in several places. But I've only found the explanation for why in one place. But after the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, soldiers on both sides reported this peculiar phenomenon, and that was glow-in-the-dark wounds. How about that? More than 16,000 soldiers from both armies were wounded or killed during the battle, and neither the Union nor the Confederate medical personnel were, remotely prepared for this kind of carnage, okay? But soldiers lay in the mud for 2 rainy days, and as the time went on, many of them noticed at night that their wounds glowed in the dark. Okay, now they were thinking it was kind of haunted, okay, but in fact, the injured whose wounds glowed seemed to heal better than the others, all right? And believe it or not, it took until 2001 when 2 Maryland teenagers solved the mystery, and they won a top prize at an international science fair, winning this. The wounds on the wounded became hypothermic, and their lowered body temperatures made ideal conditions for a bioluminescent bacteria. And so it's the only time we know of in history, and certainly during the Civil War, that the wounds glowed in the dark. That must have been creepy. Stonewall Jackson is an incredible figure during the war, and a lot of scholars believe that if Stonewall Jackson had lived, that the outcome might have been different, because he won every battle he was in. I mean, every single one of them, and he was. I mean, and it was crazy, and the North was really. I mean, he had been a teacher at Virginia, VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and was apparently the most boring teacher there. People hated his class because it was just the most boring thing. And so when the war started, and then he became an officer, everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, this guy's going to be horrible." And turns out he was, number one, he was incredibly religious. Incredibly religious. I mean, he was, in fact, he was like a Calvinist. He believed in predestination. What was going to happen was going to happen. And that is why he was absolutely cool on the battlefield. And he was a thinker that really kind of threw the North for those generals in the North, especially McClellan, just threw them for loops, because he was doing tactics that nobody had ever done. He was like marching. He, at one point, marched his guys 20-something miles in one day. I mean, that's like marching a marathon in one day. And so while he was reported, being somewhere, all of a sudden he shows up somewhere else with the troops. And there was one time that he marched away from the enemy, and they thought he was retreating, and he boarded his thousands of troops on a train and went up and around them and let them loose. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. Okay, but he was also kind of odd, and the thing that the moment that named him Stonewall Jackson was at the very beginning of the war, and actually historians today disagree on whether the guy who called him that, they disagree on whether he was giving him props or disrespecting him, because what the guy said was, he said, "And there stands Jackson like a stone wall." And so they disagree on whether that meant, man, nobody's moving this guy, he's holding the line, or whether that meant he should be moving and, he should be advancing, there he stands like a stone wall. But there's more evidence that it was meant as a compliment, because he got so good later that he was like the first nationally known general that was like revered in the South, feared in the North, and he was like a celebrity. And I mean, he would ride up and down, and people would just, the troops would cheer. And a lot of times when he had them in position, he had to tell them, "Shh, be quiet," these guys are right there. But as I said, he was a hypochondriac. Okay, there's no other way to put it. He was a hypochondriac. He thought himself like out of balance, and so he would raise his arm so that the blood would flow down into his body and reestablish equilibrium. People thought that in battle he was doing the Pentecostal thing, but he wasn't. Even though he was, very religious, he was restoring equilibrium. And as you might guess, when he first did this in the first battle of Bull Run, somebody shot his hand. It's like, oh okay. He refused to eat pepper because it seemed to make his left leg weak. Not his right leg, his left leg. And he sucked lemons, believing that they helped his dyspepsia, which was indigestion. I mean, that's what they called indigestion. But he was most comfortable standing upright so that all his organs were naturally aligned. And he suffered from poor eyesight, which he treated by dunking his head into a basin of cold water with his eyes open. That treated that bad eyesight, But he was a force, and because of his religious convictions, he just he had no fear. I mean, the letters that he wrote to his wife were just like, hey, I feel perfectly safe because until it's my time to go. And he once told a captain that on the battlefield, he feels as safe as he does in bed. And there was one time that he saw some blackberry bushes that were pretty close to the enemy lines, and he just went up there and picking blackberries and eating them, and bullets just buzzing all around him. And the lieutenant that went with him was like petrified and laying on the ground. And he said that Jackson had berry juice coming out of his mouth and said, "What's wrong with you?" And so there was a bullet that actually put a hole in his hat while he was eating those berries. And finally he said, "All right, if you're going to be that way, let's go." But that's just kind of odd. One of the most famous generals. And curiously, toward the end of the war, all his symptoms, toward the end of his life, it wasn't the end of the war, but toward the end of his life, all his symptoms disappeared. And he was in perfect health, and everybody commented on how good he looked. And if you ever seen a picture of him, he's a pretty handsome guy, blue eyes, blonde hair, and boring teacher, but great general. Here's another one. All right. Lincoln's, you remember General Sherman, okay, the burning of Atlanta and all like that. Well, Lincoln's first Secretary of War thought that General William T. Sherman was insane. And I got to tell you, there might be something to that. All right, now I'll tell you that in just a minute. But it was Sherman's, if you remember, it was his capture of Atlanta and burning Atlanta that actually won Lincoln's re-election in 1864. And that, because it was that moment that ended the Democratic Party's calling for peace talks with the South. Because, the South was winning everything. But his march to the sea and his subsequent uncontested sweep through the Carolinas just creamed the South, and it hastened the end of the war. But in 1861, when the war started, Sherman, he wasn't himself, okay? Let's just put it that way, because when Secretary of War Simon Cameron asked Sherman how many men he needed to defend the North, now, Sherman's just one piece of this, right? And Sherman asked for 260,000 men. And so that request actually caused Cameron to remove Sherman from command and send him to Kentucky under the command of another guy, which happened to be Ulysses S. Grant, okay? And that's where Grant and Sherman got to be friends. But Sherman had a nervous breakdown and was considered unfit for duty. But after Grant's rise to prominence. And after he took over the Union Army, Sherman was moved to Grant's old command. And the rest is history. When Congress moved to have Sherman elevated to Grant's position, Sherman wrote to them and he said, "General Grant is a great general. I know him well. He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now we will stand by each other." So, letter to Congress. But he was kind of considered nuts. Okay, but when you look at some of the greatest generals in history, a lot of them are kind of nuts. I mean, especially cavalry commanders. What's his name? I can't believe I can't think of his name. World War II tank commander, Patton. Yeah, I mean, Patton was kind of nuts. Okay, but one of the biographies I read that I thought was really interesting, that got me thinking about this leaders being nuts thing, was George Custer. Now, some of the most effective people back then, and Patton was a cavalry commander. That was the cav, his tanks, and cavalry historically was used as shock troops. They weren't expected to really win anything. They were expected to psychologically affect the battlefield. Because, for years you had these guys on horses, and, you got 300 of them charging a line of 3,000, and the 3,000 are so terrified that the 300 make the 3,000 run. And so... But the most effective of these guys, in Civil War, it was like Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest, Custer, and they were kind of crazy, And so I read this biography of Custer, and it let me know just how crazy he was, because his general at the time, when Custer was a colonel and commanding a cavalry, his general said that George Custer is the only cavalry commander that I ever had who was just as effective after he got married as he was before he was married. Which, when you think about it, it's like these guys would be these daredevil, head right into the teeth of it, and then they got married, and it's like, I need to actually come back from this battle. Got a wife and kids, and so they weren't as effective. But Custer was evidently crazy enough that it didn't matter if he was married and had kids or not. So, but there you go. So here is a kind of a modern day odd fact known by few about the Civil War. In 1956, it was 1956 when the last surviving veteran of the Civil War died. In 1956. Now think about this. The war ended in 1865. He died in 1956. His name was Albert Wilson, and he was 109 years old. But you think that's crazy? It was actually 2014 when the Office of Veteran Affairs paid the last beneficiary check to Irene Triplett. She was the 86-year-old daughter of Civil War veteran Mose Triplett, and Mose died in 1938. but his daughter continued receiving the $73.13 every month that was owed to her from the Department of Veteran Affairs until 2004. I mean, that's just unbelievable, isn't it? So here was the totals for the Civil War. There were about 625,000 people killed in the Civil War, and that number only includes the military people. There's an estimated 225,000 civilian casualties, which would set the total of deaths as high as 850,000. So think about this, though, and this is something that people just are unaware of. So 625,000 men dead on both sides. Of the 625,000, 204,000, only 204,000 died in battles. 421,000 died of disease. Can you imagine? The number one killer of Civil War troops was disease. The most prevalent were dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and pneumonia, and childhood stuff, really, like measles and mumps. But flies, mosquitoes, ticks, lice, maggots, fleas were rampant, and germ theory was not yet accepted medical practice. So, if you counted all the engagements in the Civil War, from clashes between a few dozen people on each side up to Gettysburg or Chickamauga, there were about 10,000 skirmishes or battles in that 4 years. And the total killed and wounded, the total casualty count of the Civil War was 1.1 million. But more men died during the Civil War than in all of our other wars combined, from the Revolutionary War to Vietnam. It was a tough war on leadership as well. Generals didn't fare as well then as they seem to now. But 65 Northern generals were killed in battle, and 92 Confederate generals were killed. And to end this odd facts known by few on the Civil War, I found a poem that was quite popular in the South after the Civil War. And this was reprinted in newspapers, and it's pretty brutal. But I'm gonna do it for you here. But this was about 6 months after the war ended that this poem was written. Nobody knows who wrote it, but it appeared in newspapers all over the South, and then started appearing in newspapers in the North, which almost started them up again. Okay, but here's what was written, and so there were 300,000 Northern casualties. So here's what it was: 300,000 Yankees is stiff in Southern dust. We got 300,000 before they conquered us. They died of Southern fever and Southern steel and shot. I wish they was 3 million instead of what we got. I can't take up my musket and fight them now no more, but I ain't gonna love 'em now, that's for certain sure. And I don't want no part for what I was and what I am, and I won't be reconstructed, I just don't give a damn. So there's the brilliant poetry of somebody. But this I think this war is still a huge fascination for people, which is why, books are continuing to be written. There's a new book out called Rebel Yell that I just read. It's about Stonewall Jackson. and it, you know, it really, it's an overview of that whole process, and it goes back and forth between Jackson and McClellan and Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and all that was going on then, and so it's curious that when you think now about the war, I guess, you know, in high school history, it takes like a day. You know, it might be an hour that they spend on it, and it's telling in many ways of human nature and what people will do when they're forced to do it, or what people will believe and fight for. And so, and there's, you know, in the in Rebel Yell, which is the book on Stonewall Jackson, there is an odd, I guess you'd call it an odd meandering that you can sense of God's hand going through that. And I don't pretend to understand that, you know, because I know that anytime, you know, wars are fought, I think both sides kind of think, you know, God's on our side, and can't be on everybody's side. You know, I am curious sometimes when I talk to people running for office that, you know, how many times I hear people say, you know, God told me I'm supposed to be a senator. You know, God told me I'm supposed to be a congressman, and so I think it's probably one of the most interesting and critical things that we have to kind of discover, or that we have to determine. And that's, who am I listening to? Am I listening to God, or am I listening to myself? So, I mean, God may have told you to run, but I don't think he would tell you you're supposed to be senator and 3 other guys. Just my thoughts. But I think that Lincoln had an, and we'll close with this. I think Lincoln had an interesting answer to that in the Traveler's Gift. And I say it's in the Traveler's Gift because I don't think he really said it, but I thought it was a good thing to put in his mouth. When David Ponder was in the tent with Lincoln, and Lincoln was about to go out and give the Gettysburg Address, David Ponder asked him, he said, "Do you think that God is on your side?" And Lincoln responds, "I'm less worried about that than I am concerned that we be on God's side." Which I think that's a pretty good distinction too. Thank you guys for joining us for this odd visit into history, and we do these occasionally. So if this is your first time, we're not always historical. Sometimes we're hysterical. So we will see you in the future, and in the future will be Thursday, right? Yeah, we'll see you Thursday. And if you lack something to do, go to the professional noticer. And even if you have something to do, You will like The Professional Noticer this week with Wes Hampton. Bye-bye. See you Thursday.